What is up, everyone? Jeremy here. Welcome to another video in my In the Mix series, the video series dedicated to everything mixing and building a great mix. This is actually going to be the first of a few videos where we're going to walk through the entire session for a track I recently put together to demo the tones of my new OD guitar. Since this track features some pretty low-tuned guitars, that being F-sharp standard on a 7-string, as well as utilizing some new mixing techniques I recently picked up, I figured it might be interesting and helpful for others to see how I went about putting this mix together. With that, we're going to go ahead and get started by looking at how I dialed in the guitar tones for this mix using my QuadCortex, as well as how you could use a few different AmpSim plugins to achieve a great tone for this type of track as well. Alright, so the very first thing I want to do is acquaint you with the session we're working with here today, in case you haven't heard it in my previous video. So here is the session. It is on the screen now, and I'm going to go ahead and just play some of this so you can hear it, and then I'll solo some of the guitars so you can hear those as well, and then we'll break down how I put together these guitar tones. Alright, so that is the session we're working with today, but more specifically the guitar tones, the rhythm guitar tones. And we're talking about a 7-string, as I mentioned before, that is tuned to F-sharp standard, which is pretty low, especially for a 7-string. So how did I get these guitar tones to sound as good as they do in the context of this mix with such a low tuning? Well, that's what I want to walk through with you now. So the way I approach this is I start by writing out all the guitar parts so I know what parts I'm going to be playing, so that I can go and put in the drums and the bass and have those so that when I'm trying to dial in the guitar tones, I'm playing along with the drums and the bass so I can hear the way that the guitar tone meshes and sits in the mix or in the context of the drums and the bass, and not just trying to dial things in solo, because just dialing in a guitar tone in solo means absolutely nothing when you go to drop it into a mix. It could clash with your bass, it could clash with your snare or your cymbal. Like, you don't know what ultimately the frequencies are going to clash with. It's going to clash with something. So you're going to need to dial things in context, and that's what I did. So let's talk about the process for how I go about dialing it in as I'm playing along in context. So what I typically like to do is start with a starter point, right? And in this case, I'm working with my QuadCortex, but the same applies for any AmpSim as well. You pick a preset that you know sounds good as a starting point. Then you start to tweak and make adjustments for the given mix in context. And so that's what I did, is I picked one of my go-to presets here, which I call Brutal Cola. And that's obviously because I'm using the Bogren Digital Christian Cola IRs here, which is why it has the cola in the name. More on that in just a little bit. But what I'll do is I'll go and start making adjustments to this preset as I'm playing back in context so I can hear it with the drums and the bass. And I knew immediately the first thing I was gonna have to do is tame that low end, because when you start tuning down lower, obviously there's gonna be more low end, there's gonna be more bass. So that's where I start here with a high pass, and the high pass I have here is at 48 Hertz, which is a pretty low high pass, but I knew some of that super low end below that point, I did not want that end up going through the AmpSim, because when you push super low frequencies like that through a guitar AmpSim, it just ends up sounding muddy and farty and loose and flabby, and it doesn't sound good. You don't want it. I knew that I also had to tame that low end and tighten it up. And the very first thing that comes to mind to do that is obviously an overdrive pedal. And for me, one of my favorites of all time is my Aris Effects Brutal Boost. And I actually have it captured in my QuadCortex here, so I can drop it in, in one of these blocks anywhere without actually having to use the analog like pedal here in my signal chain. So I have the Aris Effects pedal here, and you can see I've pulled back the bass here a little bit. So it's at negative 0.8. So I pulled that back a little bit to cut out a little bit more of the bass. And I just boosted up the volume a half a decibel just to push it just a little bit more into the amp. Then we go into the actual amp itself, which is using my favorite AmpSim out of everything that I've tried so far on the QuadCortex, at least, which is the EV1013 Red, which is based on an EVH 5153 on the red channel. So that's what I'm using here. And as you can see, do note the gain here. It is only at 1.2. I mean, it is pulled way, way back, but as you hear these guitar tones, there is a ton of gain on them. They're pretty gainy still, and that is because of the Aris Effects, that boost pedal. It really pushes a hot signal into the amp, so I'm getting plenty of saturation, so I don't need to turn up the gain anymore. If I turned it up above like 3.5, 4-ish, it was just so muddy you couldn't even hear what the notes were. So I had to turn it way back to get this good clean sound that I was looking for that fit in this mix. Then I pulled back some of the bass there, boosted up the treble and the presence. I wanted a little bit more top end to come through. Again, we're talking about a low tuning, so you're going to have to add more top end to kind of account for that, the fact that you're losing some of that top end the lower you tune. So everything I've shared up to this point on how I dialed in these tones shouldn't be any big surprise for anyone who has dialed in heavy tones for a mix like this with low tuned guitars. This is standard stuff, pulling out some of the lows, overdrive pedal, cutting back the gain, things like that. Now, where I really made the biggest impact and had the biggest overall effect on the tones, specifically when trying to dial them in to fit in this mix well, it's the impulse responses. Those have the biggest overall effect. And for me, my go-to impulse responses these days for when I'm dialing in tones for a mix are from Bogren Digital, because those packs are pre-EQ'd by some of the best metal producers on the planet. And so they've already got all of these set up and ready to go and pre-EQ'd for you to just drop them in a mix, and you don't have to worry about doing all this EQing, post-EQing and whatnot to the tone yourself. So that is what I did. In fact, I actually landed on a couple combinations of impulse responses from the Christian Cola pack, and I couldn't decide which one I liked better. And so what I decided to do was actually to use both combinations. And I have one combination on the left track, one combination on the right track, which is one of the tips and techniques that I was hinting to in the beginning of this video, is separating or adding a wider sound to your mix by using different impulse responses on the left channel versus the right channel. All right, and so we're gonna head back over to the QuadCortex now, and I will show you the impulse responses that I use. So on the left channel, what I used was the modern bright standard, I know it's cut off here, but trust me, that's what it is. The Modern Bright Standard, and then the Dark and Raw Crunch. So those two, I believe this one is from the Rainbows pack, and then the Dark and Raw Crunch is from the Chainsaws pack. And so those two together, I really liked the sound. So, you know, the Dark and Raw Crunch, it did have a darker tone to it, whereas the Modern Bright Standard had more top end clarity. And so you put those together, you kind of get the best of both worlds, and it sounded really good. So that's on my left channel. And on the right channel, I went with the Gent Parade and then the Dark Ribbon Doom. And so kind of the same story, right? The Dark Ribbon Doom, this was from the Chainsaws pack, the Gent Parade from the Rainbows pack. And the Gent Parade had more of an upper mid punch and clarity to it and some top end, and the Dark Ribbon Doom had the lower end. So I mixed those together, and I really like the way that those sounded as well. So here's what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna solo the left track so you can hear what this one sounds like. And I'm going to put it right up the middle so you don't have to worry about the panning issue. So this is just the left track. So that is the left track. And again, that was the Modern Bright Standard and Dark and Raw Crunch. And on the right is this, the Gent Parade and the Dark Ribbon Doom. And that sounds like this. So, I mean, you can hear they both kind of resulted in a very similar sound. Nice tight low end, lots of crisp top end. But there is a very subtle difference between them, which actually helped in the stereo width and the sound and creating a wider sound. And so I really liked the way that turned out. To get to that point, it's simply a process of having your drums and your bass ready to go so that you can play along with it, and then flipping through different impulse responses, playing for a little bit, listening to it, seeing how it sounds, flipping through the next one, playing with it, listening to it, hearing what it sounds like. And you can actually make this even easier for yourself, obviously, if you're using something like an AmpSim. When you're using a QuadCortex and you're trying to track the actual signal, process signal coming out of it, it's a little bit more difficult. Simply because the processing is happening in the Cortex and not in your actual DAW. Whereas if you're using an AmpSim, you could just track the DI signal and then actually just flip through different impulse responses later. So you don't actually have to play to it, which makes it a little bit easier to dial in. So that is how I dialed in these tones through my QuadCortex here with these low tuned guitars for this track. So as I mentioned in the intro of this video, I also want to show you how I dialed in some great tones through some AmpSim plugins as well, because I know not everyone watching this is going to have a QuadCortex. So I went with some fairly popular plugins here that I know lots of people have or are pretty popular anyway. So those are the NeuralDSP Archetype Nolly, NeuralDSP Omega Ampworks Granophyre, and the Line 6 Helix. So taking a quick look at the entire signal chain here as far as the plugins go, the very first thing is a tiny bit of compression on these DI tracks, and then I go into some EQ, and these are going to look kind of like bigger moves than they really are, and the reason for that is because of the EQ that I'm using here. This is the Slate Digital Infinity EQ. It has this feature where it zooms way in until you start making big moves, and then it zooms way out. So this looks maybe more drastic than it really is. But the idea here is the basic principle that I described before, is cutting out low end, and then in this case I just decided to boost up a tiny bit. It's only like not even 1 dB, around 1.4K, just to give some more upper mid clarity, and I found that worked better for these AmpSim plugins. So those are the settings, the EQ settings here. So specifically we have a high pass at 86 Hertz. We're cutting out around 136 Hertz. And then it's at 1.5 kilohertz. We're just boosting up a tiny little bit there. And so that is consistent on the left and the right tracks. Then we're going into the AmpSim plugins. And then each of the plugins have the impulse response section turned off, and that is so that I can just keep it consistent across each, and I don't have to worry about selecting the IRs in every single AmpSim plugin. And this just flows into the Ignite Amps or STL Tones Libra IR loader, and we're using Dark Ribbon, Doom, and Gent Parade here. So the very first AmpSim we're going to look at is Archetype Nolly, and you know, the usual suspects apply here. We've got the overdrive on, level all the way up, tone at about 3 o'clock, and then we've got the AmpSim. You know, you can see the settings there. And then we go into just a tiny, tiny bit of EQ. And this is what Archetype Nolly sounds like. So the next one we have up here is the Omega Ampworks Granophyre. I've got the pedal section up. The only pedal in this plugin is the plumes, and I want to call out that the level here is at like maybe 1 o'clock. I tried turning it up higher, pulling it back lower, finding some different sweet spots, and this really ended up being the sweet spot, at least for the tone I was dialing in for with these low-tuned guitars for this track. Typically, I like to turn up the level more to push the amp higher and pull down the gain in the amp. For this, it just did not work, so I had to keep it at around 1 o'clock. Then we went into the amp itself. You can see the individual amp settings here. And because I was pulling out a lot of the bass from the DI signal, in each of these amps, I've got the bass turned up a good bit to add some of that back, as well as the depth, or in some of the other plugins, it's called resonance, and that just kind of adds a lot of that lower end back as well. And then we go into the EQ, again, just very tiny moves here, just making some small adjustments, and this is what the Granophyre sounds like. All right, and the last plugin we're going to look at here is the Line 6 Helix, and this one took me quite a bit longer to dial in than the others, which has kind of been consistent with my experience with Helix. It just takes more to dial things in, but we'll take a look at what I did here. We've got a noise gate. You can see the settings there. We're going into this Green Scream, the Tube Screamer 808 here. You can see the settings there. I do have some additional volume being added after the Tube Screamer because I wanted to push a hotter signal into the amp, and the Tube Screamer here, it didn't do much as far as pushing additional volume. It just kind of tamed the low end. So I pushed some additional volume here into the amp, and then we have the amp settings. So that is those are the settings I landed on. Then going into some post EQ here, just a little bit of adding some low end was basically all I did. Just again, as I mentioned before, cutting the low end, going into the amp, boosting it back after the amp or with the amp. And so that is the Helix, and this is what it sounds like. All right, so those are the AmpSim plugins and how I dialed in these tones to work well with these low-tuned guitars like this in this track. I think they all came out pretty good. And as you can hear, there's not a large difference between really any of them, except for maybe just the way that they saturate a little bit. But they're all using the same impulse responses, so overall the tone sounds very similar. And so the last tip that I want to call out here on what I did for this track to help these guitars, to add some string definition and some string noise and some clarity to the guitars here, is a trick that I just recently picked up as a result of one of the URM Academy videos on their YouTube. And that is basically taking the DI guitar tracks, running them through a bass preamp, and blending that in with the saturated like guitar amp itself. And so here is what that sounds like with the DI signal going through a bass preamp. This is what it sounds like. And so to get that sound, all I did here was added a high pass at 770 hertz with a fairly slow taper there, just to kind of cut off a lot of that low end. I don't need it for this. It's just kind of the upper end string clarity noise that I'm looking for. And then that goes into this TSC Audio BOD bass overdrive pedal, pushing the gain all the way up just to kind of get some saturation on this. And then we blend that in with the actual guitar signal. And I'm going to blend it in with the QuadCortex signal. And this is what it sounds like. And what I'll do here is solo the guitars and just play this back with it off, and then turn it on and turn it off and turn it on, so you can hear it kind of coming in, and really pay attention to the string clarity and the string noise as this part plays. So you can really hear how that adds some additional string noise and some of the clarity from the actual strings themselves into the overall tone, which you lose when you add a lot of saturation to the guitars, like, you know, running it through a high gain amp like we're doing here. All right, everyone, that's it on this track and this session and mix. For now, there will be future videos coming on the bass and the drums, and there's a lot to go over on how I mixed the drums for this session. So if you are not a subscriber of the channel, consider subscribing. That button is right down below, and don't forget to hit that bell so you're notified when I upload those new videos. Go ahead and drop down into the comments and let me know any tips or tricks you have when mixing low-tuned guitars for heavy music like this. And as always, thank you for watching, and thank you for your support.